Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Rochelle from Rochelle.Handmade.Designs, and in this video, we are sewing a button down dress. Yes, this was not originally planned, but I figured because I like this dress, I was gonna go ahead and film it while I sew it. So this is new look 6651. Now I will be sewing along to view B on this pattern. So if you have this pattern, go ahead and take it out, and let's go ahead and get right on into the new video. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the supplies that you will need in order to construct your button front dress. So the first thing you will need is the pattern, which is new look in 6651. I will be following along to view B because I want sleeves on mine, but you can follow along to view A if you choose. Just make sure you purchase some single fold bias tape, or you can make your own bias tape. Now on the back of the pattern, it states that you do need your 10 5/8 of an inch buttons, and you also need 7/8 of an inch wide elastic in 2 yards. So the supplies that you will need is of course the pattern and the instructions. I use rotary cutters, one for paper, one for fabric. I never mix the two. I also use a pair of scissors at the sewing machine, one for paper, one for fabric. I never mix the two there. I have elastic. Now you do not have to use knit elastic. You can use woven. I do have some woven elastic right here that I will probably use the woven one instead of the knit one, but I am using 3/4 of an inch, which converts to 6/8 instead of 7/8. If you're going to use 7/8, I advise you to use 1 inch instead of 7/8 of an inch. I have never seen 7/8 of an inch elastic, but it's up to you. It's a personal preference. I have marking tools here. I have my disappearing ink, my white chalk, my white pencil. I am not using dark fabric this time. I am using white fabric this time, so I will be using my disappearing ink. I have my seam ripper just in case I make a mistake and need to rip out any seams. I have my thread clippers for the sewing machine and a point turner. You will also need pins to pin your fabric. That's all the supplies that you will need in order to construct your button down dress. So let's go ahead and get right on into the pattern pieces. Okay, so I took out the instructions to show you the pattern pieces that you will need in order to construct your button front dress. So you will need every single pattern piece. So you would need pattern piece 1 through 11. Now I do want to make a note of pattern piece number 2, which is your bodice back. You need to have wrong side of the pattern facing up, as well as pattern piece number 6, which is your skirt back. You need to have pattern piece facing up. So I'm just going to go over a couple of things with you because it also depends on the width of your fabric that you are cutting. I am using 44-inch fabric, so that's pattern piece number 2 and 6, which is face down with wrong sides facing up. Now, if you're using 58 to 60-inch fabric, you need to have pattern piece number 1, which is your bodice front, here. Number 2, which is your bodice back, pattern piece number 5, which is your skirt front, and pattern piece number 6, which is your skirt back. All of those pieces need to be cut with the wrong side of the pattern facing up. So let's go ahead and get right on into the pattern pieces. Now remind you that this one calls for all 11 pieces. So I'm just going to run through those real quickly. Okay, so the first pattern piece that you need is pattern piece number 1, which is the bodice front, and you need to cut 2. You'll also need pattern piece number 2, which is the bodice back, and you need to have this pattern piece facing down with wrong sides up, and you're going to cut around, and you're going to cut 1 unfold of fabric. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 3, which is your casing, and you just need to cut 1 of fabric. So it is 1 long, very long piece to cover your entire dress from top to bottom, and you just need to cut 1. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 4. This is your elastic guide. This is not cut out of fabric. This is just cut out of elastic, and you need to cut 2. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 5, which is your skirt front, and you need to cut 2 of fabric. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 6, which is your skirt back. You need to put the pattern facing down with wrong sides up, and you need to cut 1 unfolded fabric. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 7, which is your pockets, and you need to cut 4. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 8, which is your placket. You need to cut 2 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 9, which is your neckband. You need to cut 2 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 10, which is your collar. You need to cut 2 of fabric and interface 1. And the last pattern piece that you need to cut out is pattern piece number 11, which is your sleeves, and you need to cut 2. That's all the pattern pieces that you will need in order to construct your button front dress. So let's go ahead and get right on into the sewing. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started sewing our button front dress, or button down dress, whichever way you want to call it. So the first thing you need to do is grab pattern piece number 1 and 2. And this is your front, your bodice front and your bodice back. Now what you're going to do is go ahead and stay stitch along the neck edge for both pattern piece number 1 and pattern piece number 2. Stay stitch is done at 1/4 of an inch. So you start at the very top and then just come all the way to your center front. So go ahead and do that on both pattern piece number 1 and pattern piece number 2. So once you have, I went ahead and done mine. So what I'm going to do is, with right sides together, I'm going to pin my shoulder seams together. So I'm going to open out pattern piece number 2 with right sides up, and I'm going to go ahead and attach at my shoulders. And using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and sew across both shoulder seams and finish off your edges and press them towards the back. So go ahead and do that. Also, what you can do is go ahead and pin your side seams, matching up the notches here, pin all the way down, and then also using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and finish off your seams as well. Now I will not go ahead and sew my side seam at this point because I will attach my sleeves and sew in one continuous seam all the way down. So I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew my shoulder seams, finish them off, and press them towards the back. Okay, so now that I went ahead and sewn my shoulder seams together, I also finished off my seam allowance. I'm going to go ahead and put the bodice portion aside and grab my sleeves. All right, so that's pattern piece number 11. So go ahead and grab your sleeves, which is pattern piece number 11. And what you want to do is go ahead, I have done it on one of my sleeves, I have started gathering, but what you want to do is go ahead and gather between the dots. So there's 3 dots, which I do not use the dot system. I gather between notch to notch. So I will pull up the gathers on the notches, between the notches. So all I do is basically get the thread, and then just go ahead and gather between the notches, from notch to notch. All right, so now that you have went ahead and gathered your sleeve, the next thing you want to do is go ahead and turn up your hem. I like to do it now instead of wait until I attach my sleeve to my bodice and then do the hem. So it's just easier to do it now instead of later on. So basically the hem allowance is 1 1/4. So we'll create a line that's 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, press up to that line, and then press up the additional 1 1/4, encasing that 1 1/4, that 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and then just go ahead and stitch on the top, on the right side of your garment. Now go ahead and grab the bodice or your top portion of your dress, and with right sides together, you're going to attach your sleeve. Now I am doing the flat method. So basically all I'm going to do is attach. Now make sure you are attaching the right side. So this is the right side of mine. This is the wrong side. Do not attach it wrong side to right side. Now, because mine's is basically the same fabric on both sides, it's hard to tell. So that's why I go ahead and make little X's and numbers and stuff on mine to symbolize which one is the wrong side. So this is 2 notches here. So I'm going to match that double notch up here. I'm going to match the single notch up to this single notch, and then I have a dot. So I'm going to match the single notch up first and pin. Now that you have pinned your sleeve along your armhole, go ahead and stitch using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and then finish off your seam allowance. Now make sure that your bodice is not bunching up underneath. So you just want to sew the the sleeve into your armhole. So go ahead and do that and back stitch at the beginning and at the end using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and finish off your seam allowance. Okay, so I went ahead and sewn in my sleeves. So what I'm gonna do is with right sides together, I'm gonna go ahead and sew my side seam as well as finish off the underarm seam of my sleeve. So with right sides together, I'm going to pin at the bottom, the hem. So basically, make sure you match up your underarm seams and pin. And then you have a notch right here at your sleeves. Make sure you pin there as well and pin at the very bottom, the hem portion of your sleeves as well. And then you want to pin the hem of your bodice. So pin at the hem of your bodice. Once you pin that section, go ahead and pin at the notch right here and then pin the length of your side seam. All right, so now that I have it pinned together, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end and finish off your seams. Okay, so I went ahead and sewn in my sleeves. I finished off my side seam and finished off the side of my sleeves as well using the flat method here. So what you can do is go ahead and put your bodice portion aside and grab your casing. All right, so what you're going to do is on the unnotched. Now this is the notched edge. So I'm gonna turn it to where the unnotched edge is up at the top. So what you want to do is go ahead and press in 3/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way down. So go ahead and do that. And once you do that, you're gonna attach your casing to your bodice with wrong sides together. So I'm gonna show you how to do that. But the first thing you wanna do is go ahead and press in 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go ahead and do that. All right, so I went ahead and pressed up my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on my casing. Now go ahead and grab your bodice. And what you're going to do is attach wrong sides to wrong sides. I know it's kind of weird because normally you attach right sides facing, but this time you're going to attach wrong sides together. So what you're going to do is go ahead and attach. Now this is the wrong side of my casing. This is the wrong side of my top. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and match up. I'm going to go ahead and turn it so you could see it. Go ahead and match up the notches. So there's a notch there and here, which match up to here and here. Now that the casing is attached onto the bodice with wrong side of casing to wrong side of bodice, you're going to stitch close to the edge. So basically you're going to stitch as close to the edge as possible. Now I'm going to stitch at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. So go ahead and sew close to the edge. If you want to use a 1/2 inch, that's completely up to you. But I'm going to sew where the dot is right here all the way across to the other dot. So go ahead and do that. Make sure that when you sew from dot to dot, you are basting. So go ahead and baste from dot to dot. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so I went ahead and finished my casing portion, attaching my casing to my bodice. So basically, I'm just going to give you a rundown of exactly what I did. Now, it may be different for you depending on what size elastic you are using. So the first thing you want to do is go ahead and stitch close to that press edge that you pressed under 3/8 of an inch. Now I sewed using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and sewed as close to the edge as possible in that 1/4 of an inch. Then what I did was, there's dots that you can see. So basically what I did is sewn 1 inch away from the bottom edge. And the reason why I did 1 inch is simply because I am using 3/4 inch elastic. So if I sewed 5/8 of an inch, it would get caught and would not fit. So I sewed using 1 inch seam allowance, so my elastic will be able to fit into that first casing. So the next thing I did was sew 1 inch away from that one, which would be the center of the casing, where if you grab the casing, let me grab the casing. It's this line right here, which is the stitching line, which is the center of the casing. So I stitched that portion together right here. So it gives you 2 rows of elastic. So basically each roll of my elastic is 1 inch apart to where my 3/4 inch elastic will fit in between those. Now, if you are using 7/8 of an inch, 1 inch would work perfectly for you. If you're using something that's more than 1/4 of an inch, you may have an issue because the casing itself is 3.5 inches. So if you measure your casing from top to bottom, measure that portion, then take off 3/8 of an inch. After you take 3/8 of an inch, basically just folding 3/8 of an inch, you could measure that distance and see what's the best elastic that you can use for your casing. If you do not want to go out and buy 3/4 of an inch or 7/8 of an inch or 1 inch or whatever you choose, that's a personal preference. All right, so now that we have went ahead and sewn the bodice portion together, let's go ahead and put this aside and work on our skirt. All right, so go ahead and grab your skirt pieces. You'll need pattern piece number 5, 6, and 7. So I have pattern piece number 5 right here, and with right sides up facing you. So this is my right side of pattern piece 5. So right side's facing up towards you. You're going to apply pattern piece number 7. So you should have cut 4 of these. So you're going to apply 2 to the front and 2 to the back. So I went ahead and, like always, I marked my X where that symbolized the wrong side. So you're just going to go ahead. I'm going to move this one out the way. And you're going to pin with right sides together, pin your pockets to the side of your skirt, matching up the notch. All right, so one thing that I do want to mention is, so this is your center front, this side right here. You do not have any notches or anything in your center front. The side seam is the one with the notch and the dots. So make sure you are pinning your pockets to the side seam and not the center front seam. So once you have your pockets pinned, right sides together using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and then press your seams towards your pocket and understitch. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that I went ahead and attached my pockets to the skirt front, go ahead and grab your skirt back and you're going to do the exact same thing. Now, one thing I do want to mention on my skirt front pieces is I did go ahead and understitch. So what that understitch does is turn, so when you press it, it makes sure that it turns the pocket to the inside and create a nice, you know, basically when you turn it to the inside, it doesn't have that pocket poking out or anything on you. So that's what the understitching does. But go ahead and grab your skirt back piece, which is pattern piece number 6. And I went ahead and stitched my pockets down right here. So all you're going to do is, with right sides together, go ahead and pin your pockets to both sides of your skirt back. And then using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and just basically sew your pockets to the side seam and then finish off your seam allowance. Now, one thing that I do want to say about the seam allowance, serging my side seams, is I'm going to serge from the very top of the pocket all the way down to about an inch, inch and a half past the pocket, and then clip my threads on the serger. And then I'm going to sew the rest of it together, both seams together, because I'm not gonna sew my seams individually. So that's just a personal preference of what I'm going to do with my side seams. You do not have to do that. So once you sew your pockets together, go ahead to the sewing machine and sew your pockets onto the skirt back pieces. You do not need to understitch the skirt back. Just understitch the skirt front pieces. That's it. So go ahead and do that. So once you sew your pockets to the skirt back and you go ahead and finish off your seam allowance between the pockets, what you're going to do is, with right sides together, you're going to attach your skirt front to your skirt back at the side seams. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and match the top up. Make sure that your side seams are matching up beautifully and that your seam allowance is pressed towards your pocket. And you're going to pin. All right, so now that you have it pinned together, you're going to back stitch at the beginning, come all the way down to that dot, back stitch, break your thread, and then come all the way down to this dot right here. You're going to back stitch here and sew all the way down the side seam of your skirt, all the way down to the bottom. Once you do that, after you do that, you're going to go ahead and sew around your pockets, and you're going to do all of this using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and then finish off your side seam. And then also finish off the edges of your pockets. You're going to do that on both sides. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that I have my front pieces attached to my back pieces with right sides together. Now the next thing you want to do is go ahead and pin your pocket to your upper portion of your skirt. And then you want to baste at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So go ahead and do that for your skirt. Okay, so now that I went ahead and based the upper portion of my pockets to the upper portion of my skirt. So now with right sides together, you're going to go ahead and grab your bodice and you're going to attach the bottom portion of your bodice to your skirt. So basically, I have my bodice, and this is the wrong side up, and this is the right side. So I'm going to attach the right side to the right side of my skirt. Now, the dots right here match up to your side seam. So where your pocket is, it should match up to your side seam. All right, so now that you have your bodice attached to your skirt, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end, and go ahead and sew your bodice to your skirt. Go ahead and do that. Okay, so now I went ahead and attached my skirt pieces. So basically my skirt to my bodice. So this is my bodice up here, my skirt pieces. I attached it at the very bottom using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I went ahead and finished off my seam allowance with my serger, and then I pressed the seam allowance towards the skirt section, down towards the skirt instead of up towards the bodice. So the next thing you want to do is go ahead and grab your elastic. Now if you grab pattern piece number 4, you need to cut a piece of elastic the length of the elastic guide. So what you're going to do is you should have 2 rows of stitching. So the very top one, you're going to put a safety pin through your elastic, and then you're going to sift it all the way to the other end. All right, so now that I have the casing sifted all the way through, you're going to go ahead and pull to distribute your casing to where it's not bunched up so much. And then after you do that, you're going to secure the elastic to the ends of both sides. So you'll stitch it across on this end as well as on this end. Okay, so now that I went ahead and did both rolls of my casing and feeding through my elastic, go ahead and put your dress aside for just one moment and go ahead and grab your placket, which is pattern piece number 8. So go ahead and grab pattern piece number 8. And then what you want to do, make sure that pattern piece number 8 is interfaced on the wrong side. And what you want to do is create a 1/4 of an inch basting stitch along the unnotched edge, and then press up to that 1/4 of an inch. And then what you want to do is attach the notched edge to your dress. So go ahead and grab your dress real quick. And then with right sides together, you want to attach your placket to your dress. All right, now using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and then press your seams towards your placket. Okay, so now that I have went ahead and attached my placket to both sides of my front, now what I'm going to do is using a basting stitch, I'm going to sew as close to the edge as possible all the way down, and when I get to the bottom, I'm going to make sure I stop about 5 inches from the bottom. So I measured from the bottom up 5 inches and made my line, and I'm going to stop right there from basting, and I'm going to do that for both sides. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so I went ahead and basted close to the edge. I basted across the top, and I left 5 inches. I did not baste 5 inches from the bottom to that line where I created that line to symbolize my 5 inches. So I left that unbasted. So the next thing you're going to do is go ahead and create your hem. Now your hem allowance is 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So all you're going to do is what I did was create a basting stitch all the way across. So what I'm going to do is press up to that line and then press up one more time to encase it. All right, just to give you an idea of how to do the hem section, because I feel like someone may have problems if you have never done a button down shirt or anything. So basically what you're going to do is turn the placket onto itself. There's a dot right there. And what you're going to do is stitch across 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So basically you're going to match up that dot to this dot right here, making sure that your seam allowance is pressed towards the placket, and you're going to stitch using a regular length stitch across 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you do that, you're going to trim it down. So basically I'm just going to trim this portion down. Now I'm not cutting all the way through. I'm just going to leave a little peak right there. about right there. And then what I'm gonna do is turn it to the inside, and it gives a nice clean finish right there. And then you could go ahead and press up your hem. Now the hem allowance, like I just said, is 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So what you're going to do is press up. So basically you're gonna press to that 5/8 of an inch seam allowance line and then press up again. Or what you can do is go ahead and serge the bottom edge and then just press up and stitch it in place. Now what I'm gonna do is, because I want a clean finish, I'm gonna press to that line and then press up again and then top stitch my hem in place. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that I went ahead and finished off my hem, so what you're gonna do is go ahead and put your dress aside for a quick second and grab your collar and your neckband. So that's pattern piece number 9 and 10. So just move 9 out of the way for a quick second. And then on pattern piece number 10, which is your collar, with right sides together, you want to pin along the edge. All right, using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're gonna back stitch at the beginning. So down, pivot, so across the upper portion. When you get to this edge, you're gonna pivot and then stop at this dot. Back stitching at the beginning and at the end. All right, so now that I have sewn my collar piece together with right sides together, using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and trim down that seam allowance and clip into my corner. So go ahead and trim it down. All right, so now that I have it trimmed down, I'm gonna go ahead and clip into my corners, but do not clip through being sure not to clip through your stitching. Clip this corner as well. Being sure not to clip into your stitching. All right, so now that you have your collar stitched together and trimmed, go ahead and turn it right sides out. And if you need your point turner, go ahead and poke out your corners. I'm gonna use my point turner here. And when you use your point turner, make sure you are not poking a hole through your fabric, so just poke the corner out gently. And once you turn it right sides together, go ahead to your ironing station and give it a good press, pressing the seams up towards the facing. So press your seams up towards the facing. Go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that I went ahead and sewn my collar together, I trimmed it down, I poked out my corners, and then I turned it right side out and gave it a good press. So now what you want to do is go ahead and grab your neckband. Now, one thing I do want to mention is I do my collar and neckband a little different than what the instructions tells you to do. So you can follow along with this method that I do if you would like, or you could go ahead and pull out the instructions and follow along with the instructions. This is completely up to you. So the first thing that I want to tell you is you're going to put your interface neckband facing down, okay? You're going to put the portion of your collar that's not interface on top of it. So let me show you. So this side right here is my uninterfaced collar portion. You're going to put that down on top of your neckband. All right. And then you're going to go ahead to your sewing machine, and on the uninterfaced neckband, you're going to press up. You're going to press up 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Press up the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then trim to 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now make sure you are doing this on the single notched edge. So you have a double notched edge right here and you have a single notch edge. On the single notch edge, you're going to press in your 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then trim it down to 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. go ahead and do that, and we'll continue with our neckband and collar. Okay, so I went ahead and pressed my uninterfaced neckband, which is this one right here. I went ahead and created a 5/8 of an inch basting stitch, pressed up to that basting stitch, which is 5/8 of an inch. And now what I'm going to do is go ahead and trim it down to 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, so now that you have the neckband trimmed down, what you're going to do is put right sides together. So you're going to put the uninterfaced neckband on top of the interface side of the collar with right sides together. And then what you're going to pin is pin through all layers at the notches and at the dots. All right, so now that you have your neckband pinned to your collar, so what you're going to do is, starting at this dot, well, at the end, you're going to sew using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning, sew up across the entire neckband and collar pieces, and then come all the way back down, back stitching at the end. So you're going to come all the way across and pivot around the curve and back stitch at the end. Go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that you have sewn your collar onto your neckband, what you want to do now is go ahead and trim it down. All right, so now that you have it trimmed down, go ahead and open it and press your seams towards the facing. Okay, so now that you have went ahead and pressed your seam allowance down towards the interface neckband, go ahead and grab your dress. And with right side facing up, you want to pin your neckband, your interface neckband, to your neck edge, matching up the notches. So there's a notch there, so you want to pin at those notches. Okay, so now that you have your neckband attached to your neck edge of your dress, so using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and then trim your seams down. Go ahead and do that. Okay, so I went ahead and attached my collar and neckband, well, the neckband onto my neck edge. I went ahead and trimmed it down. So what you're going to do next is go ahead and press that seam allowance up towards your collar. And then what you're going to do, so you're going to press this edge right here up towards the collar, and you're going to make sure this edge is pressed down. So basically it's like they're meeting each other in the center. And then what you're going to do with this piece is you're going to bring that about 1/8 of an inch over that stitching. Now you have two options. You could go ahead and slip stitch using a hand needle and stitch this down, or you could pin on the right side like I'm going to do and stitch in the ditch. So you're just going to be stitching right there in the ditch. So go ahead and press that up and then decide which way you want to finish off this edge. It's completely up to you, and then stitch in the ditch. Now another thing that you can do is if you are using a label, go ahead and insert your label now before you tack this down. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so I went ahead and finished off my neckband. I encased it, added my label, and then the only thing that's left to do is on the placket with the right sides facing up, you want to sew close to that edge of the placket, the inner edge, and then remove your basting stitches. So once you do that, the only thing that you have to do is create your buttonholes on your placket and sew on your buttons. So basically, make sure you have the right side of your dress is where you're going to make the buttonholes. So make sure that this side, where when you're wearing it, it's on the right side. So wearing it on the right side, you should have 2 dots right here. So what you're going to do is grab your placket, match up those 2 dots right there, make your buttonholes, and you want to make your buttonholes in the center of your placket all the way down. Once you make your buttonholes, sew on your buttons, you are all done. So there you have it. You just finished sewing this nice, gorgeous button front dress. Now turn on that notification bell so you are notified every time I upload a new video. And also don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, keep sewing.